What would you think if I told you that the ultimate, entirely unshakable blueprint for unimaginable global wealth and enduring historical legacy was absolutely not forged in the elite, heavily guarded, and deeply exclusive halls of a prestigious Ivy League university? Nor was it secretly whispered in the opulent, velvet-draped, and cigar-smoke-filled boardrooms of powerful Wall Street bankers? The true, hidden, and incredibly profound architecture of monumental human achievement was entirely, meticulously extracted over 2 grueling, deeply exhausting decades of relentless psychological forensic work, completely birthed from a single, terrifying, and utterly insane proposition delivered in a quiet, heavily shadowed, and incredibly intimidating mansion. We must journey back to the dawn of the 20th century, stepping into the massive, echoing study of the absolute richest, most powerful, and deeply intimidating human being on the face of the earth, the legendary steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. Sitting nervously across the massive, heavy mahogany desk from this titan of industry was a young, incredibly hungry, entirely unproven, and deeply impoverished journalist. The young man had managed to secure a brief, seemingly routine interview, completely unaware that he was about to step into a psychological crucible that would violently, permanently alter the entire trajectory of modern human history. Carnegie, a man who possessed an incredibly terrifying, almost supernatural ability to peer directly into the fragile, hidden depths of the human soul, looked at the nervous young journalist with a piercing, analytical, and completely unyielding gaze. The silence in the massive room stretched on for what felt like an agonizing, suffocating eternity. The only sound the slow, heavy, and rhythmic ticking of a massive grandfather clock perfectly measuring out the finite, precious, and entirely unrenewable moments of mortal existence. Then, Carnegie leaned forward and delivered a proposition that completely, entirely defied all conventional, rational human logic. He offered to personally, directly open the incredibly heavy, heavily guarded, and entirely inaccessible doors to the absolute most brilliant, powerful, and wildly successful minds of the entire century, men like Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and John D. Rockefeller. He would grant the young journalist unprecedented, entirely unfettered, and completely intimate access to their private thoughts, their hidden fears, and their highly guarded daily routines. But there was a massive, crushing, and deeply terrifying catch attached to this seemingly glorious offer. The young journalist would have to completely, entirely dedicate 20 long, grueling, and entirely uncertain years of his brief, fleeting mortal existence to meticulously, relentlessly study these titans, to forensically extract their hidden psychological architecture, and to flawlessly distill their deeply guarded secrets into a universal, accessible philosophy of absolute success for the struggling, ordinary masses. And for this monumental, entirely unprecedented, and deeply exhausting 2-decade-long endeavor, Carnegie explicitly, coldly stated that he would absolutely not pay the young man a single, solitary copper penny. The young journalist sat completely frozen, his mind violently reeling, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the sacrifice being demanded of him. To willingly, voluntarily agree to work relentlessly for 2 entire decades completely without any guaranteed financial compensation seemed like the absolute ultimate, entirely suicidal act of profound foolishness. The heavy, ticking clock in the massive room suddenly represented the terrifying, rapid draining of his own youth and vital life energy. He was violently forced to choose between the immediate, deeply comforting, and entirely secure promise of a standard, ordinary paycheck and the terrifying, entirely uncharted, and heavily dangerous wilderness of a massive, world-altering, and completely unproven purpose. The heavy, crushing weight of severe, agonizing poverty whispered desperately in his ear, begging him to gracefully, quickly decline the insane offer and run back to the safe, predictable, and entirely mediocre comfort of the known world. But deep within the burning, restless core of his soul, a fierce, undeniable, and completely irrational spark of massive ambition violently ignited. He looked directly into the cold, penetrating eyes of the billionaire titan, completely swallowed his deeply paralyzing, heavily biological terror, and firmly, resolutely accepted the monumental, seemingly impossible challenge, entirely unaware that Carnegie had been secretly, silently holding a stopwatch beneath the heavy mahogany desk, strictly granting the young man exactly 60 seconds to make the incredibly profound, entirely life-altering decision before the incredibly rare, highly coveted offer would be permanently, violently withdrawn forever. Analyzing this incredibly primal, deeply foundational, and highly emotional moment beautifully, perfectly illustrates the absolute, completely non-negotiable, and entirely foundational prerequisite for any monumental, historic human achievement, the absolute necessity of a definite chief aim. The vast, overwhelming, and deeply tragic majority of humanity wanders completely blindly through their brief, entirely fleeting mortal existence, entirely paralyzed, deeply confused, and completely exhausted by vague, constantly shifting, and heavily contradictory desires. They vaguely wish for massive wealth. They casually, passively hope for deep happiness. And they silently, desperately pray for a sudden, miraculous stroke of unearned cosmic luck. But they absolutely, fundamentally refuse to violently plant a fierce, unyielding, and entirely uncompromising stake in the hard, unforgiving ground of reality. The young journalist's incredibly terrifying, deeply agonizing decision entirely exposes a profound, terrifying, and beautifully inescapable psychological law of the universe. When an individual definitively, completely locks their entire psychological and biological focus onto a singular, burning, and absolutely non-negotiable purpose, and willingly, aggressively burns every single, comforting bridge of safe retreat, completely, entirely detaching themselves from the toxic, deeply paralyzing need for immediate, short-term, and highly fleeting gratification, the entire, massive universe seemingly, violently, and miraculously rearranges its incredibly complex, deeply intertwined circumstances to directly facilitate their sacred mission. A definite chief aim acts exactly as a powerful, incredibly massive, and entirely invisible magnetic force, instantly, violently polarizing the chaotic, deeply confusing, and entirely random circumstances of daily life, actively, aggressively drawing the exact, necessary resources, the critical, highly aligned people, and the entirely unforeseen, incredibly lucrative opportunities directly into the fiercely focused individual's rapidly expanding orbit. Without a definite chief aim, human life is merely a chaotic, incredibly exhausting, and deeply depressing series of entirely random, highly reactive accidents. With it, life becomes a highly orchestrated, incredibly powerful, and deeply intentional masterpiece of sovereign human will. The incredibly expansive, deeply immersive narrative then rapidly transitions to the agonizing, decades-long, and highly secretive journey of the journalist as he slowly, meticulously begins to infiltrate the heavily guarded, entirely exclusive inner circles of the American Titans. He encounters the legendary, entirely self-made, and fiercely independent automobile tycoon, Henry Ford. The narrative plunges the eager reader directly into an incredibly famous, highly dramatic, and deeply intense courtroom scene that perfectly, flawlessly encapsulates the hidden, incredibly powerful psychological weaponry of the truly elite. A heavily circulated, deeply arrogant, and highly influential newspaper had foolishly, maliciously published a scathing, incredibly insulting, and deeply damaging editorial, violently, aggressively attacking Ford, publicly labeling the incredibly wealthy industrialist as an ignorant pacifist. Ford, fiercely, entirely protective of his massive, hard-won reputation, aggressively dragged the powerful publication directly into a grueling, highly public, and incredibly bitter defamation trial. The opposing, highly educated, completely arrogant, and deeply condescending lawyers attempted to mercilessly, brutally humiliate Ford on the completely exposed witness stand, aggressively, relentlessly bombarding the entirely self-educated billionaire with incredibly obscure, highly technical, and completely irrelevant historical and academic trivia in a desperate, entirely cynical attempt to publicly, thoroughly prove his complete lack of formal, traditional education. They sneered, they violently mocked him, and they desperately tried to expose him to the watching world as a simple-minded, entirely uncultured, and completely lucky mechanic who merely accidentally stumbled into unfathomable, massive wealth. Ford endured the incredibly exhausting, entirely pointless barrage of arrogant, highly academic questions with a cold, completely simmering, and deeply intimidating intensity. Finally, entirely driven to the absolute breaking edge of his formidable patience, Ford leaned aggressively forward, pointed a heavily calloused, entirely unyielding finger directly at the deeply arrogant, highly educated lawyer, and delivered a completely devastating, entirely paradigm-shifting, and deeply historical counterattack. He coldly, calmly, and incredibly powerfully stated that he currently had a specific row of electric push buttons neatly arranged on his massive desk. And with a single, effortless press of his finger, he could immediately summon brilliant, highly specialized experts who could flawlessly, perfectly answer any foolish, trivial, and entirely useless question the arrogant lawyer could ever possibly, conceivably conjure. Why? Ford fiercely, completely reasonably demanded of the entirely stunned courtroom. Should he actively, continuously clutter his own highly valuable, fiercely protected, and entirely creative mind with useless, dead, and entirely irrelevant historical facts when he completely, sovereignly commanded a massive, highly synchronized, and incredibly loyal army of deeply specialized, highly educated intellects? This explosive, highly dramatic, and completely unforgettable courtroom confrontation serves as the absolute perfect, entirely flawless, and deeply profound introduction to the absolute most powerful, incredibly revolutionary, and entirely mystical concept of the entire, sprawling philosophy, the mastermind. The traditional, deeply flawed, incredibly romanticized, and entirely toxic societal narrative aggressively, continuously champions the completely fabricated myth of the solitary, entirely isolated genius, the lone, brilliant wolf who violently conquers the entire massive world completely, entirely through their own isolated, fiercely independent, and completely individual intellectual brilliance. But the deep, incredibly rigorous, and entirely forensic analysis of Ford's stunning, completely devastating courtroom victory exposes a terrifying, highly counterintuitive, and beautifully liberating reality. True, massive, world-altering, and incredibly enduring human power is absolutely, fundamentally never, ever generated in a state of total, biological, and psychological isolation, when two or more fiercely dedicated, highly intelligent, and entirely focused minds completely, seamlessly harmonize, violently discarding their fragile, easily bruised individual egos to passionately, entirely unite around a single, massive definite chief aim. They absolutely do not merely linearly add their intellectual, highly finite capacities together, they violently, chemically, and entirely magically combine to physically birth an entirely new, completely invisible, incredibly dynamic, and overwhelmingly powerful third intellectual entity, the mastermind. Ford absolutely did not ever need to physically, biologically possess every single, trivial, deeply irrelevant academic fact in the known universe because he had flawlessly, perfectly, and entirely masterfully constructed and deployed the incredibly powerful, highly advanced psychological architecture of profound, entirely synchronized human synergy. The deeply exhausted, entirely struggling, and completely isolated individual constantly, painfully hits the hard, completely unforgiving, and deeply frustrating biological and psychological ceiling of their own highly finite energy, entirely limited perspective, and completely restricted knowledge base. But the true, absolute, and entirely masterful practitioner of the incredible mastermind effortlessly, beautifully bypasses this severe, heavily restrictive biological limitation entirely, actively, aggressively tapping directly into an infinite, completely boundless, and deeply staggering reservoir of collective, highly specialized human genius. They completely, permanently, and entirely mathematically insulate themselves against the terrifying, highly destructive forces of failure by brilliantly, flawlessly surrounding their own entirely natural, deeply human weaknesses with the impenetrable, completely unshakable, and highly fortified armor of other people's incredible, highly specialized strengths. The young, entirely transformed journalist deeply, profoundly realized that the ultimate, most heavily guarded secret of the incredibly wealthy was absolutely not their individual raw intelligence, it was their incredible, terrifying, and entirely deliberate ability to build, manage, and fiercely protect massive, highly coordinated, and completely unified alliances of extraordinary human capital, creating an unstoppable, invisible juggernaut of cognitive power that completely, effortlessly crushed any solitary, isolated competitor foolish enough to stand in its massive, roaring path. The intensely transformed young journalist, his mind violently reeling and deeply expanding from the staggering, paradigm-shifting revelations of the mastermind, physically departed the cold, highly organized, and meticulously efficient industrial empire of the legendary automobile tycoon, seamlessly transitioning into an entirely different, heavily chaotic, and intensely buzzing realm of raw, unbridled human innovation. He cautiously, deeply observantly stepped into the dark, heavily soot-stained, and incredibly disorganized laboratory of the absolute most prolific, fiercely determined, and profoundly legendary inventor in the entire history of modern civilization, Thomas Alva Edison. The ambient air in the massive, dimly lit workspace was incredibly thick, heavily saturated with the pungent, highly acidic scent of dangerous, volatile chemicals, the sharp, metallic tang of melted copper wire, and the deep, unmistakable, and entirely overwhelming aura of relentless, agonizing, and almost manic human obsession. Here, in this incredibly shadowy, deeply secretive, and entirely chaotic crucible of modern technological creation, the eagerly watching journalist was about to violently, permanently confront the absolute most terrifying, deeply misunderstood, and universally feared psychological demon that ruthlessly, aggressively plagues the entire human race. He was about to meticulously, forensically deconstruct the heavy, crushing, and completely paralyzing illusion of absolute failure, entirely witnessing firsthand how a true, unassailable titan of history mentally, biologically, and spiritually processed a series of utterly devastating, incredibly painful, and seemingly endless defeats that would have violently, instantly shattered the fragile, easily broken psychology of an ordinary, deeply average mortal man. For agonizing, incredibly stretching, and entirely exhausting years, the fiercely determined, profoundly stubborn, and heavily sleep-deprived inventor had been obsessively, violently locked in a desperate, deeply consuming, and entirely unforgiving war against the suffocating, heavy darkness of the night. He was completely, entirely consumed by a singular, burning, and absolutely non-negotiable definite chief aim, the seemingly impossible, incredibly miraculous creation of a safe, highly reliable, and entirely affordable incandescent electric light bulb that could successfully, brilliantly illuminate the entire, massive globe. But the brutal, entirely unforgiving, and deeply cold laws of physical science aggressively, relentlessly, and violently fought back against his incredible, fierce human will. The incredibly observant, deeply fascinated journalist silently, meticulously watched as the exhausted, heavily soot-covered inventor painstakingly tested incredibly fragile, highly experimental filaments, passing intense, surging, and highly volatile electrical currents through thousands upon thousands of highly diverse, completely bizarre, and entirely varied materials. He meticulously, desperately tested carbonized cotton threads, highly fragile strands of rare bamboo, incredibly thin metallic wires, and completely obscure, deeply strange chemical compounds, and every single, agonizing time, the deeply anticipated, highly fragile result was an incredibly violent, sudden, and deeply depressing flash of blinding light, followed instantly, heartbreakingly by a quiet, incredibly definitive, and entirely suffocating puff of dark, bitter smoke as the fragile filament entirely, violently incinerated, completely destroying the heavy, desperate hopes of the exhausted, highly driven laboratory team. This incredibly grueling, deeply demoralizing, and completely exhausting process of violent, sudden incineration and absolute, quiet darkness brutally, relentlessly repeated itself not merely dozens of times, nor simply hundreds of deeply frustrating times, but a staggering, incredibly incomprehensible, and deeply terrifying 10,000 individual, distinct, and entirely painful times. The heavily invested financial backers were entirely panicking, wildly threatening to aggressively, violently pull their massive, crucial funding. The deeply exhausted, heavily overworked laboratory assistants were physically, biologically collapsing from severe, acute sleep deprivation and incredibly deep, entirely overwhelming psychological despair, fiercely begging the completely obsessive, entirely driven inventor to finally, gracefully surrender to the entirely obvious, heavily undeniable, and deeply mathematical impossibility of the incredibly stubborn endeavor. To the entire, watching, highly skeptical outside world, and to the fiercely criticizing, heavily arrogant academic establishment, Edison was a entirely defeated man, aggressively, foolishly, and entirely stubbornly burning through massive, highly finite fortunes of wealth and incredibly precious, entirely unrenewable mortal time in a desperate, deeply insane, and completely futile pursuit of a childish, entirely impossible biological fantasy. But the young, intensely focused journalist deeply, profoundly noted that Edison entirely lacked the heavy, suffocating, and deeply paralyzing physiological markers of a defeated, broken, and entirely crushed human being. When an incredibly bold, deeply cynical, and entirely skeptical reporter arrogantly, aggressively challenged the highly exhausted inventor, rudely, deeply insensitively asking how it felt to have utterly, and publicly failed 10,000 distinct, highly agonizing times, Edison violently, and beautifully shattered the entire, deeply flawed, and highly toxic societal paradigm of human defeat. He fiercely, entirely confidently, and incredibly powerfully snapped back, his eyes burning with an intense, completely unyielding, and deeply intimidating intellectual fire, stating absolutely, categorically that he had not failed a single, solitary time. He had simply, brilliantly, and entirely successfully discovered 10,000 entirely distinct, highly specific, and beautifully documented ways that fundamentally, biologically, and scientifically did not work. This completely explosive, deeply sensational, and incredibly profound psychological reframing entirely, violently exposes the absolute, entirely foundational secret of immense, world-altering historical endurance. The deeply fragile, highly conditioned, and entirely average human ego views a sudden, painful, and highly unexpected setback as a deeply personal, incredibly brutal, and entirely permanent condemnation of their fundamental, inherent human worth, instantly, tragically allowing the incredibly heavy, deeply paralyzing emotional weight of the negative outcome to completely, violently crush their fragile ambition, forcing them to entirely, cowardly surrender and rapidly, desperately retreat back into the cold, deeply suffocating, and entirely stagnant comfort zone of absolute mediocrity. But the true, absolute, and entirely invincible master of this profoundly powerful, deeply mystical philosophy violently, aggressively, and beautifully redefines the entire, terrifying concept of failure, completely permanently downgrading it to the highly manageable, deeply educational, and entirely temporary status of mere temporary defeat. The incredibly rigorous, deeply analytical, and highly forensic observation of this incredibly specific, highly historical event entirely, completely proves that absolute, permanent failure is a completely fabricated, highly toxic, and entirely psychological illusion that strictly, exclusively exists within the deeply frightened, highly insecure confines of the easily defeated human mind. The physical, external, and highly objective universe absolutely does not ever deal in permanent, unyielding failure. It strictly, entirely, and beautifully deals exclusively in highly valuable, incredibly objective, and deeply educational data feedback. Every single, agonizing, and completely devastating collapse of a highly anticipated business venture, every incredibly painful, entirely unexpected rejection of a deeply cherished, heavily labored creative project, and every suddenly, violently shattered interpersonal relationship is absolutely not a massive, heavy, and completely definitive stop sign violently erected by a cruel, entirely indifferent universe. It is, instead, a massive, incredibly bright, highly illuminated, and deeply necessary directional beacon, violently, aggressively steering the fiercely dedicated, completely unyielding individual entirely away from a highly flawed, deeply inefficient methodology and directly, powerfully pointing them toward a significantly superior, highly optimized, and incredibly successful alternative approach. The young, entirely transformed journalist deeply, profoundly realized that the ultimate, most heavily guarded secret of the incredibly wealthy and historically legendary titans was absolutely not that they possessed a magical, completely unshakable immunity to tragic, highly painful, and deeply devastating setbacks. It was that they fiercely, aggressively, and completely relentlessly utilized those deeply agonizing, highly painful setbacks as the exact, incredibly heavy, and highly necessary foundational building blocks of their incredibly towering, massively unassailable, and deeply legendary success. To absolute, truly invincible masters of this philosophy, the incredibly heavy, deeply terrifying word, quitting, is entirely, completely erased from their vast, highly expansive, and deeply powerful psychological vocabulary. Armed with this incredible, deeply profound, and entirely invincible psychological armor against the highly paralyzing fear of failure, the young, intensely eager journalist completely, seamlessly moved deeper into the incredibly complex, highly secretive, and deeply intertwined labyrinth of the incredibly elite, meticulously hunting for the next, entirely crucial, and highly foundational pillar of absolute, undeniable success. He aggressively, carefully turned his deep, highly analytical, and completely unyielding focus toward a completely counterintuitive, highly bizarre, and deeply profound behavioral pattern that seemed to heavily, entirely violate every single, incredibly rigid, and highly established rule of traditional, completely transactional economic capitalism. The vast, overwhelming, and deeply impoverished majority of the struggling, entirely exhausted working class strictly, entirely operated on a highly rigid, deeply cynical, and incredibly limiting philosophy of absolute, entirely exact minimal exchange. They fiercely, entirely stubbornly demanded completely guaranteed, highly immediate, and entirely exact financial compensation entirely upfront before they would ever, completely begrudgingly agree to physically, biologically lift a single, highly reluctant finger. They rigorously, entirely obsessively tracked their heavily supervised, highly exhausted hours, absolutely, completely refusing to ever deliver a single, solitary, and entirely uncompensated ounce of extra, highly valuable life energy to their entirely ungrateful, highly demanding corporate employers. They firmly, deeply, and entirely tragically believed that by strictly, fiercely withholding their ultimate, completely highly capable effort, they were cleverly, brilliantly outsmarting the massive, deeply unfair, and highly exploitative economic system, entirely unaware that they were actually, violently, and completely permanently chaining themselves to the heavy, sinking, and deeply rusted anchor of absolute, entirely inescapable poverty and extreme, highly suffocating mediocrity. The journalist entirely, profoundly discovered that the absolute, true, and incredibly rare masters of immense, generational, and entirely sovereign wealth operated on a completely inverted, highly terrifying, and beautifully expansive cosmic principle, the habit of doing more than paid for. He meticulously, carefully studied the incredible, deeply meteoric, and entirely shocking rise of legendary, entirely self-made industrial executives who entirely began their incredibly lucrative, massively powerful careers as deeply impoverished, highly ignored, and entirely insignificant low-level clerks or deeply exhausted, incredibly grimy manual laborers. These incredibly rare, highly extraordinary individuals entirely, completely refused to play the incredibly small, deeply toxic, and entirely limiting game of strict, highly exact minimal compensation. They aggressively, entirely joyfully, and completely relentlessly poured massive, incredibly overwhelming, and deeply stunning volumes of highly superior, completely uncompensated, and entirely excellent value directly into their daily, seemingly highly insignificant, and deeply mundane tasks. They consistently, fiercely arrived incredibly early. They happily, completely voluntarily stayed entirely late. And they continuously, aggressively anticipated the deep, completely unarticulated needs of their highly stressed, incredibly demanding superiors, entirely delivering incredibly flawless, highly superior, and completely massive results that completely, violently dwarfed their incredibly meager, entirely pathetic, and deeply insignificant initial financial salaries, to the deeply cynical, entirely lazy, and completely average observer. These incredibly dedicated, highly intense individuals seemed like entirely foolish, deeply naive, and highly exploited victims of a ruthless, completely unforgiving capitalist machine. But the incredible, deeply profound, and entirely mathematical analysis of this specific, highly bizarre, and completely unnatural behavior entirely, beautifully exposes the massive, highly guarded, and entirely infallible cosmic law of the universe, the law of increasing returns. When an incredibly driven, completely focused, and deeply unyielding individual consistently, fiercely, and completely relentlessly over-delivers massive, highly undeniable, and entirely superior value completely without the desperate, highly paralyzing, and completely toxic demand for immediate, entirely exact financial compensation, they absolutely, fundamentally, and violently trigger a massive, deeply powerful, and entirely unstoppable cosmic chain reaction. They completely, permanently brand themselves as an entirely rare, deeply indispensable, and highly coveted human asset in a massive, entirely crowded, and deeply mediocre global marketplace filled entirely with lazy, incredibly entitled, and deeply apathetic competitors. The incredibly massive, deeply powerful, and entirely unyielding universe entirely, fundamentally abhors a vacuum of uncompensated value, while the incredibly exact, highly immediate financial reward might be temporarily, entirely agonizingly delayed. The massively compounded, deeply exponential, and completely overwhelming cosmic payout is entirely, mathematically, and beautifully inevitable. The incredibly wealthy, deeply powerful, and highly observant titans of industry completely, entirely rely on these incredibly rare, highly exceptional, and completely over-delivering individuals to successfully, flawlessly run their massive, incredibly lucrative empires. The seemingly foolish, entirely exploited clerk is violently, rapidly, and incredibly exponentially promoted past entirely all of their deeply cynical, highly bitter, and entirely lazy peers, eventually, inevitably capturing incredibly massive, completely life-altering, and entirely sovereign equity stakes, immense, highly lucrative corporate partnerships, and vast, deeply unshakable, and entirely generational financial empires that completely, mathematically, and entirely beautifully dwarf the incredibly meager, highly insignificant, and deeply microscopic initial uncompensated effort. As the deeply exhausted, incredibly fascinated, and highly transformed journalist meticulously, carefully codified this immense, deeply cosmic law of incredibly massive, highly delayed compensation, he immediately, violently encountered yet another massive, deeply terrifying, and entirely formidable psychological barrier that completely, entirely destroys the fragile, highly desperate ambitions of the completely uneducated, incredibly naive masses, in order to successfully, flawlessly, and entirely perfectly execute the massive, highly complex, and deeply intertwined strategies of the mastermind, and to incredibly accurately, completely safely navigate the deeply terrifying, entirely unmapped wilderness of temporary defeat. The fiercely dedicated, entirely sovereign individual absolutely, fundamentally requires a highly advanced, entirely impenetrable, and incredibly sharp psychological filtration system. The narrative deeply, violently plunges the completely immersed reader into the highly toxic, incredibly chaotic, and deeply deafening landscape of the average, deeply entirely uneducated human mind, introducing the profoundly critical, entirely non-negotiable, and highly protective pillar of accurate thought. The vast, overwhelming, incredibly highly tragic, and deeply impoverished majority of humanity exists in a completely, entirely suffocating, heavily paralyzed, and entirely toxic state of profound, deeply blinding intellectual confusion. They are completely, helplessly, and entirely violently tossed around by a massive, incredibly loud, and deeply chaotic hurricane of completely unverified, highly toxic, and entirely destructive public rumors, deeply malicious, highly fabricated, and entirely baseless societal gossip, and fiercely passionate, entirely uneducated, and deeply subjective personal opinions entirely masquerading as solid, highly objective, and completely undeniable absolute truth. The young, entirely awakened, and deeply analytical journalist completely, meticulously observed that the truly, incredibly elite, highly powerful, and entirely sovereign masters of absolute, monumental success possessed an incredibly terrifying, deeply surgical, and entirely ruthless psychological ability to completely, violently sever completely useless, highly emotional, and entirely fabricated societal opinions from hard, highly objective, and completely verifiable empirical facts. The heavily conditioned, entirely average, and deeply lazy human mind aggressively, fiercely, and entirely continuously seeks the absolute, incredibly comfortable path of absolute least cognitive resistance, readily, entirely eagerly accepting highly comforting, completely false, and incredibly toxic generalizations completely without ever exerting the massive, highly exhausting, and deeply necessary intellectual effort to deeply, completely, and entirely rigorously verify the actual, underlying evidence, but the true, absolute, entirely invincible practitioner of accurate thought completely, violently treats every single, highly circulated, and deeply accepted piece of external information with extreme, entirely cold, and highly forensic skepticism. They entirely, ruthlessly demand completely solid, highly objective, and entirely undeniable empirical proof. They deeply, profoundly realize that entirely acting upon a deeply flawed, highly inaccurate, and completely unverified premise is the absolute, mathematically guaranteed, and entirely inescapable recipe for massive, highly catastrophic, and entirely permanent financial and psychological ruin. By rigorously, entirely fiercely filtering the massive, deeply deafening, and highly toxic noise of the chaotic, deeply confused world entirely through the incredibly sharp, deeply unforgiving, and entirely highly objective lens of absolute, verifiable truth, the sovereign, entirely powerful individual successfully, entirely flawlessly protects their massive, highly finite, and incredibly precious cognitive energy, entirely preparing their fiercely focused, highly disciplined, and completely unshakable mind to deeply, completely master the final, incredibly mystical, and deeply profound psychological forces that absolutely, mathematically guarantee the complete, entire, and incredibly beautiful manifestation of their ultimate, highly sacred, and entirely non-negotiable definite chief aim. The fiercely disciplined, entirely protected, and incredibly sovereign mind, having completely, violently, and entirely flawlessly mastered the highly analytical, deeply objective, and entirely unforgiving pillar of accurate thought, now actively, aggressively, and beautifully prepares to plunge directly into the absolute deepest, most profoundly mystical, and entirely terrifying psychological ocean of the entire, highly complex human experience. The young, incredibly exhausted, but deeply awakened, and highly transformed journalist meticulously, carefully, and entirely forensically observed that the absolute greatest, most historically legendary, and entirely unassailable titans of massive global industry possessed an entirely secret, deeply guarded, and incredibly powerful internal channel of direct, unyielding, and entirely deliberate communication with the massive, entirely submerged, and highly formidable architecture of their own deep subconscious mind, the vast, overwhelming, highly tragic, and deeply impoverished majority of the entirely uneducated, deeply frantic, and highly reactive masses blindly, entirely foolishly treat their own subconscious as a dark, highly unpredictable, and deeply terrifying dumping ground, constantly, relentlessly, and entirely unconsciously filling its massive, highly fertile, and completely unyielding depths with incredibly toxic, highly paralyzing, and entirely destructive seeds of deep, biological fear, entirely fabricated societal self-doubt, and incredibly paralyzing, heavily catastrophic anxiety. They entirely, passively allow the chaotic, highly negative, and entirely cynical external world to deeply, permanently program their internal, highly sensitive biological hardware, entirely, tragically guaranteeing an external, highly physical reality of deep, unyielding poverty, immense, highly suffocating struggle, and completely, entirely unbroken failure, but the true, absolute, entirely invincible, and highly legendary masters of monumental, world-altering success aggressively, fiercely, and completely ruthlessly guard the sacred, highly vulnerable, and completely invisible gateway to their own profound subconscious reality. They entirely, brilliantly, and highly systematically utilize the incredibly profound, deeply mystical, and entirely psychological weapon of applied autosuggestion. The journalist completely, entirely watched in absolute, breathtaking awe as these incredibly powerful, highly dominant, and entirely sovereign individuals actively, aggressively, and fiercely bypassed the highly critical, deeply analytical, and incredibly cynical conscious mind, deliberately, systematically planting incredibly vivid, highly emotional, and completely unshakable images of their ultimate, sacred, and entirely non-negotiable definite chief aim directly into the deep, fertile, and completely highly receptive soil of their subconscious. They absolutely, fundamentally, and deeply realized that the subconscious mind is incredibly, deeply, and entirely completely blind. It absolutely cannot logically, rationally differentiate between a highly vivid, incredibly detailed, and entirely fabricated emotional vision and a hard, highly objective, and completely verifiable physical reality. By continuously, fiercely, relentlessly, and entirely obsessively feeding the subconscious mind a massive, incredibly dense, and highly saturated diet of absolute, entirely unyielding, and completely triumphant success, heavily drenched in deep, entirely authentic, and highly powerful human emotion. The subconscious entirely, blindly accepts this highly fabricated vision as absolute, unshakable, and entirely undeniable truth. It then violently, aggressively, and incredibly miraculously mobilizes all of its massive, highly infinite, and deeply cosmic resources, silently, powerfully working 24 hours a day, completely entirely beneath the threshold of conscious, daily human awareness, to brilliantly, flawlessly, and entirely mathematically transmute that invisible, psychological desire into its exact, massive, highly physical, and completely entirely undeniable material equivalent. As the incredibly arduous, deeply exhausting, and completely unprecedented 20-year forensic marathon slowly, beautifully, and agonizingly approached its ultimate, highly monumental culmination, the deeply transformed, highly educated, and entirely sovereign journalist violently, unexpectedly collided with a massive, incredibly profound, and entirely ethical dimension that completely, entirely shattered his deeply held, highly cynical, and entirely preconceived societal notions regarding the true, underlying nature of massive, generational global wealth. The incredibly toxic, highly prevalent, and deeply embittered societal narrative constantly, relentlessly preaches the absolute, incredibly false myth that staggering, monumental, and historically unassailable financial success must absolutely, fundamentally be violently, ruthlessly extracted through the deep, highly malicious, entirely exploitative, and entirely sociopathic destruction of incredibly vulnerable, heavily marginalized, and entirely innocent competitors. But the deep, incredibly rigorous, highly forensic, and completely unyielding analysis of these incredibly rare, highly legendary, and entirely unassailable 500 masters entirely, completely exposed a profoundly different, incredibly beautiful, and entirely universal moral architecture. He deeply, profoundly discovered that while ruthless, completely unethical, and highly malicious cunning might temporarily, incredibly violently secure a massive, incredibly short-term, and highly fleeting financial victory, it mathematically, absolutely, and entirely inevitably triggers the incredibly destructive, highly karmic, and entirely inescapable forces of total, absolute ruin. The true, absolute, entirely unassailable, and completely enduring titans of generational legacy entirely, completely operated upon an incredibly strict, highly unyielding, and deeply sacred, entirely philosophical foundation, the Golden Rule. Fiercely, tightly coupled with massive, entirely ironclad, and highly unyielding self-control. The incredibly profound, deeply analytical, and entirely psychological breakdown of this highly specific, entirely universal moral law entirely beautifully reveals that the incredibly complex, heavily intertwined, and deeply interconnected global human marketplace is fundamentally, biologically, and mathematically entirely allergic to deeply selfish, highly malignant, and completely entirely exploitative human actors. The incredibly rare, highly powerful, and entirely sovereign leader who entirely, permanently masters absolute, ironclad self-control violently, aggressively refuses to ever act upon the deeply destructive, highly primitive, and entirely biological impulses of sudden, violent anger, incredibly deep, entirely toxic jealousy, or massively short-sighted, entirely destructive human greed. They deeply, profoundly realize that entirely destroying a competitor through highly unethical, completely malicious sabotage absolutely, fundamentally, and deeply inevitably breeds a massive, highly toxic, and entirely heavily armed legion of deeply vengeful, highly motivated, and completely unyielding enemies who will relentlessly, aggressively scheme to violently, entirely destroy their fragile, heavily compromised empire. Instead, the ultimate, entirely invincible, and highly legendary master actively, fiercely, and completely entirely adheres to the incredible, deeply ancient, and highly profound golden rule, intensely, consistently treating absolutely every single highly valuable human connection, every seemingly insignificant, deeply impoverished laborer, and every incredibly massive, highly formidable global rival with the exact, highly unyielding, incredibly deep, and entirely profound respect, total fairness, and complete, absolute honesty that they themselves fiercely, intensely demand from the chaotic, deeply unpredictable universe. This incredibly rare, deeply profound, and highly ethical behavioral pattern absolutely, fundamentally is not merely a highly naive, completely entirely sentimental, or deeply weak moral platitude, it is, in absolute, highly rigorous, and entirely undeniable fact, the absolute most incredibly lethal, highly calculated, and deeply effective, entirely long-term economic strategy ever conceived in the entire, incredibly violent history of global capitalism, by consistently, fiercely operating with absolute, unquestionable, and completely entirely verifiable integrity. The sovereign, highly powerful individual builds a massive, heavily fortified, and entirely impenetrable emotional and economic moat of deep, unshakable, and entirely universal human trust. In times of incredibly deep, entirely terrifying, and highly catastrophic macroeconomic panic, when the heavily compromised, highly unethical, and deeply malicious empires violently, instantly crumble into complete, entirely irreversible dust, the heavily trusted, entirely ethical, and deeply beloved leader is aggressively, fiercely, and completely enthusiastically entirely supported, entirely rescued, and incredibly beautifully elevated by the massive, heavily loyal, and entirely completely devoted network of human capital they have meticulously, entirely beautifully cultivated over incredibly long, highly grueling decades of pure, unadulterated, and completely entirely honest service. The culmination of all these incredibly powerful, deeply profound, and entirely mystical psychological and behavioral pillars ultimately, beautifully, and violently converges into the absolute, final, and entirely staggering universal law that the exhausted, deeply enlightened journalist meticulously, carefully codified, the law of cosmic habit force. He profoundly, deeply, and incredibly terrifyingly realized that absolutely nothing in the entire, massive, highly complex, and entirely interconnected physical universe is ever completely left to blind, entirely chaotic, and completely highly random chance. The entire, incredibly boundless, deeply majestic, and completely highly synchronized cosmos operates entirely, strictly on the incredibly profound, deeply inescapable, and highly mathematical principle of endlessly repeating, entirely heavily ingrained, and completely unbroken habits, the silent, incredibly massive, and completely unyielding gravitational orbits of massive, highly entirely celestial planetary bodies, the incredibly reliable, highly predictable, and deeply cyclical rhythm of the changing global seasons, and the exact, incredibly precise, and highly biological functions of the human nervous system are all entirely, completely governed by this incredibly massive, deeply cosmic, and entirely unseen force. The incredibly powerful, deeply profound, and highly liberating revelation for human psychology is that an individual can absolutely, entirely, and completely consciously harness this incredibly massive, deeply terrifying, and entirely cosmic energy to entirely, automatically, and beautifully guarantee their own ultimate, highly sacred, and entirely non-negotiable success. When the deeply dedicated, entirely highly sovereign, and completely fiercely focused individual consistently, relentlessly applies the incredible, deeply profound principles of the master mind, continuously, aggressively filters their environment through the incredibly sharp, entirely highly objective lens of accurate thought, and continuously, fiercely practices incredibly massive, entirely uncompensated service, they entirely, gradually move these highly difficult, incredibly exhausting conscious actions into the deep, entirely highly automatic, and completely effortless realm of their own deeply programmed subconscious habits. Once a highly positive, incredibly deeply empowering, and entirely success-oriented behavior successfully, flawlessly crystallizes into an entirely automatic habit, the massive, incredibly powerful, and highly cosmic universe literally, physically, and entirely completely takes over the heavy, highly exhausting, and deeply manual lifting, the deeply established, highly cosmic habit violently, aggressively seizes entirely total control of the individual's physical actions, silently, powerfully propelling them forward with incredibly massive, highly unstoppable, and entirely terrifying exponential momentum directly toward their absolute, highest, and entirely most deeply cherished definite chief aim. The individual no longer has to violently, painfully, and exhaustingly force themselves to succeed, they absolutely, fundamentally, and entirely biologically cannot stop themselves from incredibly, magnificently, and entirely highly successfully conquering their massive, towering, and entirely highly deeply coveted goals, completely carried along by the absolute, most incredibly powerful, highly entirely unseen force in the known, massive universe. Finally, incredibly beautifully, and entirely magnificently, the heavily ticking, incredibly massive, and entirely highly formidable grandfather clock perfectly, entirely struck the final, deeply echoing hour of the incredibly staggering, highly entirely unprecedented, and deeply monumental 20-year forensic marathon. The journalist, his hair now incredibly lightly touched by the entirely undeniable, highly physical passage of 2 long, heavily exhausted decades, but his entire, massive internal psychology entirely, violently, and beautifully forged into an incredibly indestructible, highly sovereign, and deeply entirely magnificent weapon of absolute human empowerment, successfully, flawlessly emerged from the dark, highly secretive, and incredibly heavily guarded inner sanctums of the world's absolute most incredibly powerful, highly entirely legendary, and deeply historical titans. He had successfully, meticulously, and incredibly brilliantly fulfilled the entirely insane, completely seemingly impossible, and deeply terrifying proposition delivered to him by the incredibly intimidating, highly legendary steel magnate so many incredibly long, deeply exhausting years ago. He had successfully, flawlessly distilled the chaotic, highly complex, deeply entirely guarded, and incredibly secretive behaviors, completely unyielding mindset patterns, and highly profound spiritual philosophies of exactly 500 of the absolute, entirely undeniably greatest, incredibly highly wealthy, and deeply historical achievers the modern, highly industrial world had ever entirely, completely produced. He sat alone in his entirely quiet, deeply peaceful, and highly illuminated study, gently, carefully placing his incredibly heavy, deeply calloused hands upon the massive, towering, entirely complete, and incredibly heavily bound manuscript that would soon violently, beautifully, and entirely permanently alter the psychological, biological, and entirely highly financial destiny of millions of desperately struggling, completely deeply exhausted, and highly searching human souls across the entire, massive, incredibly connected globe. The ultimate, earth-shattering, incredibly profound, and deeply psychological, meaning that the law of success, fiercely, aggressively, and beautifully intends to convey to its exhausted, highly manipulated readers is a complete, violent, highly intellectual, and entirely spiritual revolution against the deeply entrenched, globally accepted, incredibly toxic dogma that massive, world-altering human achievement is the exclusive, heavily guarded result of blind cosmic luck, entirely unearned privilege, or highly isolated, incredibly entirely solitary genius. The core, beating, highly profound, and completely undeniable message is that ultimate, enduring, highly generational success is an absolute, entirely incredibly exact, highly reproducible, and completely mathematical psychological science that fundamentally, entirely relies on the aggressive, incredibly ruthless mastery of one's own deeply highly fragile, easily entirely manipulated mind. The book serves brilliantly as a profound, transformative, incredibly sharp, and highly psychological blueprint, teaching absolutely that by aggressively, ruthlessly defining an entirely uncompromising chief aim, heavily prioritizing the harmonious, deeply entirely highly cooperative power of the mastermind, rigorously filtering all highly toxic noise through accurate thought, and entirely, fiercely delivering incredibly massive, highly uncompensated value, you can effectively, beautifully hack the deep, entirely highly cosmic forces of the universe and violently accelerate the accumulation of absolute, undeniably sovereign power. The final, transcendent, incredibly powerful, and completely unshakable lesson is one of radical, terrifying, beautifully uncompromising, and entirely absolute liberation. You absolutely do not ever have to passively, weakly surrender your highly finite, incredibly precious mortal destiny to the chaotic, heavily entirely indifferent winds of completely random chance. Whatever the fiercely focused mind of man can completely, deeply conceive and intensely, emotionally believe, it can absolutely, mathematically, and undeniably achieve.